2018. Our bustling nation revolves around its overall peace and its morals and standards. While there are always conflicts, we live freely among them. Very few people in the U.S. live with concerns for their civil rights and needs, but do they know what all brought them to this state of happiness? The fight for freedom started the very moment that the first human civilization was born, but today we are going to focus on a more recent and interesting endeavor, the German Peasants' War. Starting in 1524, the German Peasants' War was an uprising, brought about by the majority of the peasant population in Germany. Peasants, who were essentially sharecroppers for lords and nobles, had no true social status, and many were not even allowed to own land. Many of their other civil rights were violated by their landlords as well, and this angered the peasants. As the word spread, peasants all over Germany started to engage in small battles with the armies of the noblemen, and very rarely winning. As the death toll rose, many of the lower classmen relented in their attacks, and finally gave up only a year after their aggression started. In the end, the death toll rose to over 100,000, possibly more or less, as peasant death records were not the highest priority for most German kingdoms. What few rights the peasants had were stripped, and those left living wished they had not survived. The German Peasants' War is fairly similar to the American Revolution in a sense. A weak group stood up to a tyrannous force in their lives in both situations, leading to civil rights reform. The major difference is that the Americans, well, they officially won. But when examined more closely, the peasants were victorious in another, more indirect way. A religious reformer in Zurich, Germany, named Huldrych Zwingli, strongly supported the peasants' movement, as his father was a land-bearing peasant himself. While Zwingli did not ever get himself tied to any of the peasants' actions, it is recorded that he strongly supported the theme of bringing civil rights to all citizens. So, while the German nobles were distracted by the peasants and the churches were filled with the injured, Zwingli started reform in many of the churches in Zurich during 1525. Huldrych's statements were passed around, and many of the churches agreed with him, and decided to simply hold a short communion instead of a long, drawn-out mass, where priests must preach out a section of the Bible to the people. Not only this, but many churches became more transparent to the people about exactly what they were doing, and stopped associating money with God's holy acceptance of citizens in heaven. People started to spend less time and money on the church, and had more time to work on gaining profit instead of their normal subsistence farming, which is farming for one's own well-being. The effects of the German Peasants' War did not stop here. Let's skip 60 years later in Great Britain. William Shakespeare was in his 20s, and was living through his successful life with an inner conflict. He loved a man. As had been proclaimed by many scholars, and even is implied in his own sonnets, Shakespeare was bisexual. The only issue with this is that churches condemned homosexuality, and almost all people were religious at the time. So, how did he hide this? Well, with help from Huldrych Zwingli's religious reform 4 decades before Shakespeare's birth, the Anglican Church spread all over Europe. Due to shorter session times of church and less monetary connection to the religious figures, most religious figures did not know Shakespeare very well other than the fact that he was a famous playwright. Through the death of 100,000 peasants, the ability for equality to be spread was enabled, and people were able to live more freely for years on end. Even today, we would not have such freedoms as we do if churches fed us lies that kept us ignorant and poor. Not only this, but, in a country that is ruled by the majority, people who have the most influence will always have the most power. So, if churches had not been led to be lenient through these series of events in the past, who is to say that we would have any equality or freedom? Whether it is the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, or a few skirmishes 5 centuries ago, the events and actions of other people can influence even the smallest of nuances in our lives today.